To make 3 films out of one shortish book, they have to turn it into an epic, just as Lord of the Rings is an epic. But The Hobbit isn't an epic, its tone is intimate and personal, and although it's full of adventures and excitement, they're on a different scale to those of the bigger book. Around the time of The Lord of the Rings, it was a shock to me just how big it is to be on that kind of media juggernaut. It was a big thing and the scrutiny was shocking. Lord of the Rings was my first experience making movies, and at the time, I had no ideas how movies were done. I thought that's the way they're done, so in a way, I had nothing to compare it to. That was the big effect Lord of the Rings had on me. It was discovering New Zealand. And even more precious were the people, not at all like the Australians. Orlando's a really cool guy. They hired him for Lord of the Rings out of drama school. He's very new at this still and doesn't have a lot of experience. So we were in this together and we've tried to help each other out. We felt very equal, which was good. Mike and I were really interested in other epic Legends lore properties, like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, but we knew that we wanted to take a different approach to that type of genre. Our love for Japanese anime, Hong Kong action kung fu cinema, yoga, and Eastern philosophies led us to the initial inspiration for Avatar. The Lord of the Rings movie set an entirely new standard for fantasy in the movies. Originally, when I went off to work on The Lord of the Rings, I got a call from my agent saying that I was just going to do a voice. But I couldn't really approach it like that. To get Gollum's voice I had to play the character. That is definitely something that I feel more comfortable with now. When I did Lord of the Rings, it was something I wasn't quite prepared for. I didn't know how to deal with that sort of attention. And I kind of shied away from that, but I'm better at dealing with that now, a lot better. I think The Lord of the Rings holds perhaps a deeper place in people's hearts than The Hobbit, the book, does. Lord of the Rings is a good thing for us because it opened the door for the genre in general. Le Guin's stories are very different from Lord of the Rings. I think even back as far as Lord of the Rings, there was always the chance that The Hobbit would be made, even way back then. Of course at that point, Peter Jackson didn't probably think at that point that he'd be directing it. Lord of the Rings fandom was massive, worldwide, entrenched. Generally it had been part of the fans' life all their life, because they had it read to them as children. They'd become Tolkien students. I love action-adventure type films, mythical adventures like Lord of the Rings, or superhero films like Batman. Lord of the Rings, I think, is far and away the most brilliantly done stuff. Consensus wisdom has it that all modern commercial fantasy novels fall into 2 camps, those derived from J.R.R. Tolkien and those derived from Mervyn Peake, the Lord of the Rings template or the Gormenghast mold. I was also known as Frodo because I was an early adopter of The Lord of the Rings. I'd already started directing short films when we were doing Lord of the Rings, then video game projects. I read The Hobbit at the age when you're supposed to read it. I didn't read The Lord of the Rings. My father, who was an English teacher, advised me that once I had read The Hobbit, that would be enough. I could then move on to Dostoevsky. Maybe by his 2nd year in Hogwarts, Harry Potter will learn the trick to making a movie this good, but don't bet on it. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, is one of the best films of the year. I can remember watching Lord of the Rings and being truly regretful that I wasn't a being in that world. Gollum is Gollum, though in Lord of the Rings he's 600 years old and in The Hobbit, he's 540, so he looks a little bit more handsome. There was a combination of not wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth, but also really not wanting to be stuck in Lord of the Rings for the rest of my life, and being desperate to kind of make sure that I could do something else with my life. I have a great deal of sympathy for reluctant readers because I was one. I would do anything to avoid reading. In my case, it wasn't until I was 13 and discovered The Lord of the Rings that I learned to love reading. I actually watched Lord of the Rings right when it came out, so maybe 2001 or 2002 or whenever that was. But I watched those movies, and I ended up loving them so much that I found every behind-the-scenes feature and every sort of making-of clip they had. I'd never heard of The Lord of the Rings, actually, so I went to the bookstore and there it was, 3 shelves of books about Tolkien and Middle-earth, and I was like, holy cow, what else am I missing out on? I'm never going to be able to leave Mexico, really. It would be foolish of me to do it. I would be wasting such a great opportunity that the accident of life, or destiny, gave me, which is to be Mexican. If we would make Lord of the Rings analogies, I think Mexico City is Middle-earth. That's where the fight of humanity is. I'm proud of Lord of the Rings. I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime role, and a once-in-a-lifetime film. It was made with so much care and passion and meticulous detail, and everybody was so behind it. They were the books to read, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A rite of passage going through life. Our daughter's name Arwen comes from Arwen in Lord of the Rings because my wife and I met for the first time in the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford where J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis used to go to read out their stories to one another. I loved Pan's Labyrinth. It transported me into another world. I like fantasy worlds. I love Lord of the Rings as well, for that reason, because you really get out of reality and go somewhere else. To get an Oscar would be an incredible moment in my career, there is no doubt about that. But the Lord of the Rings films are not made for Oscars, they are made for the audience. In the same way Lord of the Rings was an interpretation of the book, The Hobbit is being treated the same way. It will be faithfully represented with a fresh interpretation. I'd never read Lord of the Rings until I was asked to play Gandalf, so I didn't really know it was a frightfully famous book. My favorite all-time work of fiction, Lord of the Rings. My favorite all-time non-fiction book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Ask me again next week, you'll get a different answer. My first score for The Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, was the beginning of my journey into the world of Tolkien, and I will always hold a special fondness for the music and the experience. Tolkien is eminently filmable, I think. The Lord of the Rings is intensely landscape, but Discworld is about dialogue, which is one reason why it might be hard to film. I'm a big fan of the Harry Potter movies and the Lord of the Rings films. I happen to be a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I do an annual marathon of the extended editions. Dune is the best-selling science fiction book of all time. It's something you really need to read in your lifetime. If you're going to read The Lord of the Rings, which everyone should, then you have to read Dune, too. The backgrounds in Lord of the Rings are all explained. Lord of the Rings was something I always wanted to do. I read the book when I was about 25, and I was always hoping if it was ever made into a feature film that I would be involved in some way. And then I finally got it, and I was over the moon. It was fantastic news. I like The Lord of the Rings and ninja swords. I was always a sci-fi and fantasy geek. I was in the Lord of the Rings club and all my cool friends made fun of me. When you see Lord of the Rings, you want to feel like you've been dropped into it and that you're part of it. You don't want to be aware of how it's being done, you just want it to feel really seamless. Lord of the Rings made me realize that I'm not interested in doing anyone else's work. Everyone was very deeply involved in the world of The Lord of the Rings. From the wardrobe department to lighting, all were fascinated with the story. This is something that does not happen usually. Lord of the Rings was just so much enjoyment. It was over about the space of a year that I was filming. It's one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done, so emotional. I thought I had the rights to The Lord of the Rings. I don't know how Jackson ended up with the rights. A friend forced me to watch The Lord of the Rings, and even though it was a fantastic movie, I could only watch one. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.